Got a little story for you here today. Martin Luther, we've all heard of that Protestant reformer, but did you know about his lineage, his ancestors, his descendants? Because he did have children, and one of those children was Paul Luther. He was a physician, medical chemist, and alchemist. So this further ties together Protestantism with Freemasonry, with European paganism, esotericism, and alchemy. Generally, on the right wing, people like to characterize Calvinism and Protestantism as an early form of leftism, whereas the Catholic Church is supposed to be true to the European pagan roots. I don't see that. I see actually quite the opposite in many cases. It's a mixed bag. You can make an argument either way, but here's the argument for the other side. He was a physician to the Duke of Saxony, the Elector of Brandenburg, the Elector of Saxony, and his successor. He taught alchemy to Anne of Denmark, who is a Danish princess. She apparently was a major influence on the introduction of Orthodox Lutheranism, and she was influential in the decision to persecute Calvinists. Very striking woman in her picture. You can go look up Anne of Saxony. And she was a pharmacist. Pharmacy and pharmaceuticals and drugs in the modern medical industry grew out of alchemical literature. So Paul Luther was the son of Martin Luther. His father said of him, he is destined to fight against the Turks. There was a war between Charles V and Don Fernando, and the Duke of Alba. So the Lutheran League. There was a war. He fled from the war, returned to Wittenberg. There was an outbreak of bubonic plague in 1552. Fled again. Began his career as a medical student in Wittenberg. Became an enthusiastic Lutheran and defended his father's teachings. He was a personal physician, a chemist, and developed different drugs that were produced by the pharmacies of Saxony. He was interested in alchemy, the production of gold, and died in 1593. He himself had 6 children, who Johannes Ernst Luther became a canon of Zeitz. Through him, the male line of the family continued until 1759, and there are 5 other children listed there. So, just an interesting factoid. Martin Luther, his connection with alchemy, his connection with European paganism through the son. And you can actually look up the father of Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther's father looks strikingly similar to him, but he actually looks more serious, more warlike. Luther has this kind of androgyny to his face in a lot of the pictures, but his father is much more masculine. So that's a little history for today I wanted to introduce with. And I want to lead into, arbitrarily, I want to get to the main topic of this video, which is 5 really different topics. 3 main ones, but the first 2 being the sympathy with the right wing. That sympathy then, over time, becomes soured because the right wing has so many liabilities. It holds on to tradition, it holds on to conservatism, and it holds on to these things as axioms in and of themselves without understanding the evolutionary origins of these axioms, without understanding the environment from which these axioms came. So the right wing has a huge amount of context denial and lack of context awareness. When we talk about sexuality, when we talk about marriage, when we talk about gender, when we talk about race and ethnicity and culture and identity, when we talk about civilization, when we talk about religion, we have to understand that the traditional or the conservative or the historical conception of these things was based in a past context, a different time, a different place. And the conception that we had of those things in the past may have been the best conception. This is something the left isn't willing to recognize or admit. The left isn't willing to recognize or admit the idea that, hey, maybe if you live in an era where 50% of children born are going to die before they reach adulthood, maybe you do need to have a strong patriarchy to force women to be constantly pregnant, otherwise everyone's going to die out. Concepts like that, the left is usually not willing to admit. So they're not willing to admit that traditional morality had a place, that conservative morality had a place. The problem with the right is they're not willing to accept change. They're not willing to accept the fact that, hey, the conditions that made these ideals so important long ago no longer exist to promote those morals and values into the future. And so you're just carrying dogma on. It wasn't dogma at the time because it served a purpose. It served an evolutionary purpose, but we're now in a different scenario. Technology has changed the fabric of human society. We can't rely on old dogmas to carry us toward future evolutionary success. And that is the goal of the right wing usually, is they'll talk about some form of evolutionary success, whether it's Christians talking about converting everyone to Christianity, or ethnocentrists talking about promoting, preserving their own ethnic group. Whatever, people on the right are usually thinking in terms of some kind of pragmatic real-world success, and they think these past dogmas are going to get them there. Whereas the left is saying, no, we shouldn't care at all about any sort of evolutionary success. We should just, open the gates, open the hearts, and do whatever feels right. Now, I'm going to get into the source of that, right? So I looked at the right and I said, I sympathize, I understand where you're coming from, but I have to move on. And I have to move on, and that's where I found myself on the left. And I had another conundrum, because being on the left doesn't feel authentic when the left perpetuates so many lies. And the left does sort of the opposite of the right, whereas the right says, hey, look at these good things from the past, we should continue them to today. The left says anything from the past is bad, and it just has to be opposed on account of its historicity. If it's old, it's bad. And that's equally deceptive and equally deceitful. Again, it's a type of context denial. So when you have these two dogmatic forces, and you oppose both of them, or elements of both of them, you have to move on to some kind of new area. Some people call that a third position, but third position is something that's already been captured by the right wing. Okay, third position, fascism, National Socialism, that's already firmly in the camp of the right wing, in the left-right dialectic. Third position is fundamentally a right-wing phenomena. So I don't think there is a genuine third position in the colloquial sense that people use this term third position. Oh, we're going to be economically collectivist, but we're going to be socially conservative. You're on the right wing, okay? There's nothing third position about that. Economics is not important. So moving on, how do we then establish ourselves within sociological space, political space, anthropological space? How do we establish ourselves? How do we label ourselves? How do we conceive of the world? If we're not looking at it through a right-wing lens and not looking through it through a left-wing lens, then how do we describe ourselves? I mean, some people go for, I'm a moderate, or I'm a realist, or I'm a pragmatist, or something like that. But that doesn't really tell me what is your assessment of the world at this point. What is your realistic perception of the world? The right wing carries certain connotations, the left wing carries certain connotations, but just saying you're a realist doesn't tell me anything. I mean, you could be a realist and say, hey man, I'm just calling it like it is. Lizards control the world. I'm just calling it like it is. Okay, that's your opinion of reality, but it doesn't tell me the lens that you're using to ascertain reality. So let's try to be more specific today. And I want to come up with 3 lenses that we can use to perceive reality today. The first is post-racialism. And post-racialism, or admitting we're in a post-racial era. post-racial globe, a post-racial America. What we have to understand about this prefix post is it doesn't mean negate. We don't mean a non-racial era. It's very different. And I want to put this in a Christian context. So in classical, or not classical necessarily, but in medieval writing, in traditional European writing, if we're talking about the years, we're talking about years after Christ. Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. So the medieval Christian writers, everything that they looked at in history referred to one single person, one single event, one single era, and that was the life of Christ. Everything in history was compared to the life of Christ. And so for the medieval Christians, they were living in a post-Christian era. Now, a lot of people, when they hear that word post-Christian, they think, oh, you're talking about a time after Christianity dies. That's not how I'm using the term. What I mean by a post-Christian era is that it means everything after Christ, whereas the pre-Christian era is the time before Christ. And so this is their entire conception of history. Prior to Christ, everything was sinful, everything was terrible, everything was disgusting. You had a few Greek philosophers who may have had an inkling of the Holy Spirit. They might have been noble pagans or whatever, but most people were unsaved. It was a terrible place. Then Christ came in, trampled down death with death. Then you had the post-Christian era. So Christ in his life is this axiomatic, this axis, really, upon which history revolves on both sides. You have the pre-Christian, the post-Christian. So according to medievalists, they were living in a post-Christian era. When we talk about a post-racial era, I'm not saying an era in which race no longer matters. In the same way, when I use post-Christian, I'm not saying a race in which Christianity no longer matters. What I'm saying is that when we talk about a post-Christian era, we're talking about an era which is now defined by a single axiomatic conception of race, with that which comes after being our era, and that which comes before being the past. So this is difficult to understand because when we talk about a post-Christian era, certainly we have the birth and life and death of Christ to refer to chronologically. And this leads into my second point, which is post-history or post-historicity. This was introduced, I believe, by Francis Fukuyama, and prior by, I think, a Slovenian Stalinist who was in favor of Henry Ford, whose name I don't remember. Maybe if I look at Stalinist Henry Ford, that's going to pop up. It's probably going to say, Ford signs agreement with Soviet Union. Victor Herman, a Jewish American. I don't know what that is. H.G. Wells thinks he's more leftist than Stalin. Victor Herman spent time as a prisoner of war in the gulags. He became known as the Lindbergh of Russia. Born in Detroit. Interesting life story. But that's not who we were looking for. We're going to find that guy later. The point is that when we talk about a post-historical era, we're sort of referencing Fukuyama here. And we're talking about a time in which history itself becomes the axiom upon which we differentiate the contemporary from that which is not contemporary. Again, this is a meta concept. It's hard to understand, but when I say those are old white men, those are dead white men, there is an implicit moral association there that they are bad, they are negative, they're uncool, they're not hip, they're not up to date. So there's a negative connotation when I say dead white men. Whenever I say that's ancient history, there's a negative connotation there. Whenever I say, that's out of date, right? These all have negative connotations. So that's what I mean by we are in a post-historical era. We're living in post-history. Morally, with respect to the fact that we view the past as evil and we view anything that comes after the past as good. Now, what is the past? Well, that's difficult because the benchmark for the past is constantly shifting. I just saw a statistic today that showed something like a majority of millennials support a third option on forms for gender. So male, female, and then other. The silent generation, who are in like their 80s by now or older, They said 30% they were in favor of it. So that's pretty radical. The goalposts keep shifting. What was, I think I used the example recently of Megyn Kelly, said, if you dress up as let's say a famous, beautiful black woman for Halloween, not to make fun of her, but to just say, for my Halloween costume, I want to be someone beautiful. And I'm going to choose this black woman, and I'm just going to tan my skin a little bit to sort of fit the attire, fit the costume. And she said that was okay, and she was lambasted for that. And that was within the last year. So things are changing quickly. We're in a post-historical mode where the concept of what is ancient history, what is the past, who are the dead white men, that keeps getting pushed and pushed and pushed. So unlike Christian history or post-Christian medievalism, you could always refer back to Christ as an anchor in time. You could always say, well, now we're living in the era of Christ. And there was a pre-Christian era, but that's the dark, stormy times. We don't really think about it. We don't talk about it. We don't investigate it very much. We're not really concerned with the pre-Christian era. We're not really concerned with the Jews so much. I mean, the priests might read the Bible, and they might learn from the lessons of the Bible. But really, all of that only has significance in that it led up to the birth of Christ, the life of Christ, the death of Christ. They had a chronological event that was real in history that they could refer to in order to have a stable sense of history. Now that we live in a post-historical age, the goalpost of who are the dead white men, who are the racists, who are the sexists, who are the Nazis, that goalpost keeps shifting. So originally the Nazis were Hitler, literally Hitler, right? It was the Germans in the 30s and the 40s. And then a shift happened where all of the values of the soldiers who fought against Hitler, the values of whiteness and normative whiteness, the values of, let's say, gender normativity or something like that. All of these values have shifted to the point where now the people who fought against the Nazis are Nazis themselves in contemporary discourse. There's an equivocation there. So the goalposts keep shifting, and so we're in a post-historical age. There's no benchmark where we can say, okay, it was Karl Marx, back in the 1848 revolution, when he really got the communist movement going, that is when we can say people became moral. Or it was in 1965 during the civil rights movement, that's when people became moral. Or no, it wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that we finally attained a global world order, and that's when morality and wokeness and the correct moral code came into being. We can't ever solidify or codify a moment in history when people finally became moral and righteous and good. We can't do that. We can say today, oh, Hillary, she's moral and righteous and good. Or Kamala Harris, she's moral and righteous or good. Or, the goalposts might shift. Maybe it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she is moral, righteous, and good. So the goalpost keeps shifting, and we don't really know where it stops because it doesn't necessarily stop. We actually haven't reached the post-racial society. We haven't reached the benchmark. The benchmark's always moving. The post-racial society, the event of racial equality is imagined as something in the future. It's something attainable. It's something we're always approaching the limit of as we go into infinity, but we're never actually quite touching it. So that hasn't happened, and that's the post-historicity. Whereas in medieval Christian times, you could look back to the time of Christ and say, hey, Paul, he was a moral guy. Jesus was a moral guy. His disciples, most of them were moral guys. Or they were all saved by Christ, or even though they had some sins, they were still saved. So you could create a benchmark. You could say prior to Christ, no one was saved and everyone was going to hell. But then Christ came and he died for our sins, past and present and future. And so that is when people started to become good. So there's a historicity to Christianity that you don't see prior to Christianity. Prior to Christianity, there is an endless historicity. That is, there is very little conception of an evil past. For pagans, for Romans and Greeks, for example, it would be difficult to tell a Greek or a Roman, okay, so tell me the point of the past when your ancestors were evil. they would kind of look at you funny and they would say, no, if we go back far enough, we'll find that our ancestors lived in a golden age. They came from Atlantis, or they were perfect, or they were androgynous, or, you just keep going back for them, and they would say, no, as you go farther back in the genealogical record, our ancestors only become more and more glorious back to the beginning of time, or back to the origins of the gods. Certainly in the Norse saga, that's how it's portrayed, that if we go back far enough with our ancestors, we find eventually we go back to the ancestry of Odin himself. So, in pre-Christian times, the conception of a post- and pre-historical event that decides moral axioms was not a real concept. Like, you wouldn't say, oh, well, prior to Odin, everyone was evil. Well, there really is no prior to Odin. Or prior to Zeus. I guess prior to Zeus is the best one I have. You could say, well, prior to Zeus, giants ruled the earth and titans ruled the earth. And so I guess within Greek civilization, they had a post-Olympian era and a pre-Olympian era. That's the best that I could approximate in terms of comparing it to a post-Christian era and a pre-Christian era. But in our current conception of post-raciality, this post-raciality is also post-historical, meaning that there is no past event that we can refer to and say, this was the defining event, this was the Olympian revolt of Zeus, or this was the Christian revolt of Christ. There's nothing that we can go back to and say, this was the final revolution to trample down death with death and to bring in a golden age of light. We can never go back to something in history and point to that as a stable foundation and compare ourselves to that. We're always in this post-historical mode of pointing towards some future post-racial dream and referring to that as an imagined ideal of goodness, rather than pointing back to, oh, well, Martin Luther King, he was perfect. No, he was flawed in a number of ways. He wasn't woke enough. He was too conservative. He wasn't radical enough. And you can do this with Malcolm X. You can do it with a number of figures. Oh, they weren't radical enough. They weren't woke enough. They didn't understand white supremacy far enough. So this line of reasoning from post-racialism, which is in itself a post-historical conception of morality as opposed to the Greek conception or as opposed to the Christian conception. What I then want to close up this discussion with is the concept of trans-Judaism. Now, trans-Judaism, the way that I'm using the prefix trans is in reference to transhumanism. And that transhumanism could be misanthropic. A transhumanist could say, I hate humanity and I want to fix humanity by transcending it. Now, transhumanism didn't begin as a technological movement. It actually began as a philosophical movement. In modern philosophy, we think of the Übermensch, the man overcoming himself, from Nietzsche. But Nietzsche is really going through Schopenhauer, inverting a lot of Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer is referring to the ancient traditions of the ascetics. And the ascetics, they have a priest who goes and lives up on a mountain is a transhumanist, philosophically. A Buddhist who meditates in a temple is a transhumanist. He's trying to overcome the limitations of humanity. And in the sense that Schopenhauer described, he is trying to overcome his own will, his own desire, the lust of his flesh. He's trying to transcend that and tap into some higher universal consciousness. So that is a type of transhumanism that is now, the word is now associated with technology. But I think there is an original transhumanism that actually predates all these technological developments and fantasies. So that's the sense in which I'm using the term trans-Judaism, is very similar to transhumanism. Transhumanism, again, someone could be a transhumanist and at the same time be a misanthrope. That's possible. Although you're not required to be misanthropic to be a transhumanist. You could love humanity and say, okay, humanity is great, we just need to ascend beyond it. We just need to keep improving. And the parallel between transhumanism and trans-Judaism is that transhumanism says that humans are the template upon which we must build. Trans-Judaism says Judaism is a template upon which we must build. And the most concise way I could describe this is to say that Judaism is the fountain from which we got Christianity, it's the fountain from which we got Islam, and therefore it's the foundation of the modern world. right? If you account for all of the contributions of Islam and Christianity and Judaism all wrapped together, you pretty much get the modern world. Now you could say, oh, well, what about China? What about Japan? Well, without the influence of Western technology, which is firmly rooted in, the Islamic Golden Age, bringing over the Greek transcripts of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, preserving those. Okay, back to Christianity's influence, its hegemony, its impact on the Western world, its imprint. And then back to Judaism and the continuing influence of Jews in scientific revolutions. You look at all that together and it's like, well, look at how much progress China has made in the last 80 years, 100 years. Because of the influence of the West, China has adopted Western technology and gone from a third world African status. Seriously, I mean, Chinese were just starving. It was a subsistence agriculture lifestyle with no progress for thousands of years. And then Western technology comes over and now it's exploding. So in my mind, it's very difficult to make the case that China and Japan and Korea, that these countries have any sort of independent influence that is somehow separate from this Islamic, Christian, Judaic foundation. Certainly they have their own separate influences, but what I'm saying is that if we're looking at this like a genealogical tree, there's no country, there's no culture, there's no influential entity or institution in the world today that is not somehow, in part, founded by Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. And so essentially, for us to think about humanity, we're in a post-Jewish world. There was a world before Judaism, an ancient world, and then there was a world after Judaism. And as that expresses itself and unfolds itself, we unfold modernity. So how do we characterize Judaism? Because it's such a, as I've said before, it's such a splintered sect. Some Jews claim to be an ethnicity, they claim to be non-religious, they claim to be secular, they claim to be skeptics like Sam Harris, they claim to be agnostic or atheist. Other Jews are Orthodox, and by Orthodox they mean follow the Torah, the Talmud, and sometimes the Kabbalah. But some Jews reject the Talmud and the Kabbalah, and they're firmly rooted in the Torah, Torah-only Jews. So there's a small number of those in Ukraine and Israel, and maybe some in America as well. But you take all of these people together and you say, well, what do they all have in common? What's the common thread here? What's the common core? And there is a common sense of separateness, that there is an in-group, there is an out-group. And for Orthodox Jews, what this usually means is there's the Jewish community, and we're circumcised, and we follow the Jewish laws, and we follow the Sabbath, and then there's the outside world. And this is similar to the Amish, for example. The Amish say, well, okay, we're our isolated community, and then you have the outside world. Now, for secular Jews, assimilated Jews, their conception of the world is that we're the Jews, and we are a nomadic people. We're a people without a homeland necessarily. We're a people who are outside of the mainstream. So we don't have our own ethnic space. We don't have our own ethno-state. Now, Israel complicates this a little bit, and we can get into that. We can get into the situation of Israel. What is Israel? Israel is this little dot on the map surrounded by hostile states, supposedly. So in each case, whether we're talking about the Orthodox Jew living in the shtetl, living in a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn, whether we're talking about the Zionist Jew who lives in this little isolated island of Israel in the Middle East, whether we're talking about the assimilated Jew who exists as a communist, as an atheist, as a leftist, as a revolutionary, as an artist, as a libertine, as a bohemian, someone who doesn't follow the mainstream culture, someone who's not conservative. Even within the conservative movement, I mean, you look at someone, whether we're talking about Ben Shapiro or Dave Rubin or Milo Yiannopoulos, whether we're talking about any of these self-identified Jewish conservatives, I think Dave Rubin identifies as liberal, it doesn't matter. But you're looking at these people and you're saying, well, the conservative movement in America and the West generally is overwhelmingly white and implicitly Christian, and it has this sort of culture. And then you're coming in as a Jew as a minority, right? So I've described this before as minoritarianism. Minoritarianism is this distinct sense, this distinct feeling that you are a minority and you're situated in a sea of otherness. And therefore, you're reciprocally infected with this otherness, and your identity becomes that of the other. So this dynamic, then we can describe how this dynamic spreads and evangelizes itself and finds allies with the minoritarian mindset. Where let's say you're a minority, let's say you're a sexual minority, and the mainstream culture, you don't get along, or there's this difference or this alienation, you might then look at a racial minority or a religious minority or an ethnic minority and feel some kind of trans-minoritarian kinship. You'd say, hey, well, I'm black and I'm persecuted for being black. I'm discriminated against. I don't feel at home in this normative white culture. And so my natural ally is a guy who's gay, because he also doesn't feel at home or in place or welcomed within this heteronormative culture. And I feel a natural kinship with someone who's Jewish, who also feels alienated from the majoritarian normative culture. And so all of these minoritarian groups can then feel a common kinship. This is complicated, of course, by the fact that they might have different dogmas, different interests, and they might compete, or where their interests might conflict. Then there might be a breakdown in what the modern left calls intersectionality. So it's not a perfect kinship, but it does exist to an extent, and we can see it throughout history that when you have two oddballs, the oddballs form a common bond around their oddballness. And that can be described under the term minoritarianism. And I think it can also be described under the term trans-Judaism, because the Jews really typify this minoritarianism. There are, of course, other groups like the Brahmin, but the Brahmins see themselves as connected in a great chain of being, in an organic hierarchy in the caste system. They say, we Brahmin, we're sort of the brains of the Indian caste system, or we're the priest class of the Indian caste system. You also have the warriors who are designed to fight. You have the workers who are designed to work. Everyone has their own place in this system, and we're all sort of interdependent on one another. Whereas that's not necessarily the case with the Jews, where they have a conception of not relying or not needing or not being organically connected to others, this radical separation, this commandment in the Torah to be radically separate from your neighbors, to not intermix, to not intermingle with your neighbors, which is anti-majoritarian. It is against the conception of assimilation. And even when we talk about assimilated Jews, we talk about people who are often profoundly alienated. Now, we could go on to say how Judaism, I would be on firmer ground and my arguments would be more solid and more convincing if we were living in the 19th century when Jewish emancipation was right around the corner or had already happened in many countries. I'm on less firm ground when we talk about today, where we have people who are half Jewish, quarter Jewish, married to a Jew, have Jewish children, whatever. There's all kinds of mixing that creates an overlap between the minoritarian mindset and the majoritarian mindset. So these two mindsets, these two ways of thinking, we can think of them like languages, and we can think of certain people who are mixed. We can think of them as sort of bilingual people who can understand both perspectives, people who can come from one to the other. And that's kind of what I mean by a trans-Jewish perspective, is that you're saying, look, this Jewish seed, which continues to the present day, but it's affected and it's influenced so many parts of our society, and it's influenced our global culture. And you can't, if there was an idea somehow, if someone wanted to free themselves of some aspect, like say, I'm going to eliminate all Asian culture from my life, well, that would be relatively easy. Stop watching anime, okay, don't read manga, maybe if you want to go really far, stop eating noodles, I don't know. You could try to take it pretty far. You could stop using gunpowder, okay? Maybe there's some inventions you need to stop using. But it would be much easier in my mind if someone said, I want to completely disconnect myself, uproot all traces of Asian culture from my thinking, from my language, from my religion, from my cultural practice. It'd be very easy to do that. It would be very easy, even if you were an Asian, to say, well, I want to just eliminate all Western thinking. I'm just going to go back to my, maybe not as easy, but it's theoretically possible. I'm just going to go back to my Asian roots. But in a global sense, for someone to say, well, I'm going to erase all traces in my cultural memory, in my linguistic ancestry, in my religious thought, my spiritual thought, I'm just going to eliminate any Jewish influence. Is that even possible? There's an argument to be made here where instead of using the term trans-Jewish, I should be using the term trans-European. A trans-European perspective that, with globalism, it's kind of impossible to escape the cultural roots of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. That their linguistic system, their alphabet, their way of thinking, their cultural life, religious life, it spread so many seeds across the planet that, again, it would be hard to untangle yourself from that genealogy. So, one could make the argument, I'm not even saying that we live in an exclusively trans-Jewish society. I'm not even saying that Judaism occupies this position as the only global ancestor of our cultural landscape. You could also say that the Proto-Indo-Europeans occupy a similar position, and you could argue which is more influential. Is it Proto-Indo-European culture? Is it Jewish culture? Which is more influential globally? We could have that debate, but certainly this is how I want people to start thinking, or this is how I want to start thinking and exploring this line of thought, that when we look at the past, when we look at history, we have to understand that context. There is a post and there is a pre. There is an axis of history. There is a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, but that there's an axis. And for Christians, the axis is Christ. And for Greeks, the axis might have been Zeus and the Olympian revolt. And we could look at various cultures and try to analyze what is their axis. What is their event, their grand event? For the Romans, it would be something like the rape of Lucretia. There was prior to the rape of Lucretia, and then there was after. And then later on, you had Virgil writing about Aeneas. So you could say before the Trojan War, after the Trojan War. These big historical events that define people's thinking of right and wrong, heroic and villainous, good and bad. We have to understand these axiomatic items that previously were rooted in some kind of chronology of history, but today the chronology itself has been demonized. History itself is demonized. History itself is bad. So we can't really go back to one single event or one single person, and that person is the archetypal hero. We have to look forward to some kind of imaginary, or it's a negative rather than a positive conception. The Greeks could say, who is the greatest? Zeus is the greatest. The Christians could say, who is the greatest? Christ is the greatest. In this historical moment, who can we say is the greatest? We don't have a king. That's a differentiating factor, that the Greeks theoretically had a king, or the Athenians might have had Athena, the Spartans might have had Apollo. Okay, there might have been regional differences, but there was an agreed upon head, right? And in the Jewish religion, the head is Yahweh, right? So there's a head. In Judaism, there is no post and pre-Yahweh, although maybe you could conceive of some kind of nothingness prior to Yahweh. But I think in Judaism, maybe you would say a post and pre-Abraham, a post and pre-Moses. There's actually a lot of historicity in Judaism, which is interesting if we think about how influential Judaism is. We've now abstracted history to the point where we've escaped history. We've gone into a post-historical mode, and there is no golden age we can refer to. There is no grand hero we can refer to. There is no anti-Hitler. Churchill is imperfect. Churchill was a racist. He was a sexist. He's not the perfect angel that we can point to. He's not the God King we can point to and say, that is the ideal. That is the King of Kings. We can't do that anymore. There is no anti-Hitler. There's Hitler as a negative that you should flee from and seek not to be. And this is the minoritarian aspect of our culture, that in a majoritarian culture, you have a single Godhead, a single king at the top of the hierarchy that you can point to and say, okay, we all have different roles, we all have diverse stations in life, but we all point upward this great chain of being to that Godhead, to Zeus, to Christ, to Yahweh. We're all pointing up to something positively. We're positively being drawn in that direction. And that's sort of a Hindu conception of karma and reincarnation as well. But in this post-historical mode, all we have is a negative conception of who you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be Hitler. If you want to be a transgender male, you can be. If you want to be a mixed race individual, you can be. You can be proud of that. If you want to be Jewish, you can be proud of that. So you can be so many different things. There's no one thing that is promoted above all, or there's no unifying element here. There's only this negative Hitler. So who is the anti-Hitler? And I would make the argument that the anti-Hitler is this trans-Jewish idea, this global Jewish idea, that if the single man Hitler is the greatest evil and he is the moral referent against which all other evil is referred to, oh man, that serial killer was so evil, he was almost as evil as Hitler. And it's like, hey, don't insult the serial killer, he wasn't that bad. He is the guy that we all refer to, not to Genghis Khan, not to Stalin, not to any other. We refer to Hitler. So who is the anti-Hitler? Well, it's not one man, although there are some candidates. Harry Houdini was said to be the greatest magician of all time. He was a Jew. Albert Einstein, supposedly the greatest physicist of all time, another Jew. Bobby Fischer, one of the greatest chess players of all time, called a Jew, even though he's quite anti-Semitic. So we could look at some individuals, but no one really sticks out to me as the king. Was Einstein the king? Well, Einstein said some mean things about Indians. He traveled to, I believe it was Southeast Asia, and he saw people squatting on the ground and eating in that position, and he said it was barbaric, or he compared them to animals or something. So Einstein's not perfect. It's very difficult in this post-historical age, if we identify Hitler as the greatest evil, who is the opposite? Well, there's no single personality that's the opposite. There's this fragmentation of the mind, fragmentation of the personality, where people are expected to change. There's no stability. And there's this conception of, if you aren't constantly changing your fashion and your mode of thinking and your speaking, then you're dying. You're not a real person. You're not authentic if you're not constantly changing and revamping. Nothing can stay the same. So we're in this post-historical mode, a post-personal mode, where people are no longer a concrete entity, or that's not the ideal. The ideal is to be gender fluid, right? One day I'm male, one day I'm female. That is the ideal. So being the opposite of Hitler's a man, but the opposite of Hitler is not a woman, because a woman is complementary to Hitler. A woman that's a female ideal matched up against a male ideal. So you can't just be a woman. You actually have to negate that complementary system of patriarchy and femininity. You have to transcend that dialectic entirely by becoming transgendered or by becoming gender fluid and constantly switching roles from being dominant to submissive. You can never choose one flavor of ice cream. You have to try every flavor continuously. In all directions, you have to be multipolar. And you have to be global. You have to be minoritarian. So when we talk about the Jewish people and the contradiction of the Jewish people of, how can we even talk about the Jewish people? I spoke in the last video about how can we even talk about racism if races don't exist? It's all a social construct. You start poking at the races and they just deconstruct and they fall away. And it's like, well, what is there to hate here if there was nothing to begin with? So can racism really exist? Can the Jewish people really exist? Is that interesting paradox of okay, well, we can't even nail these people down. We don't even know who they are. We don't know what they believe. We don't know what defines them. And yet they are such a powerful influence on our world. They're so important for understanding our mindset. And so that's why, one of the reasons why I think describing a post-historical world, a post-political world, and maybe you could call it a post-Hitler world. If Hitler is the moral axiom upon which our age revolves, in a negative sense, not a positive sense. Remember, the Greeks, their positive axiom was the Olympian revolt. The positive axiom of Christians was the life of Christ. There is no positive axiom in our current world of post-history, prehistory, or post-morality, pre-morality. There is only a negative axiom, which is Hitler. And when Hitler's defeated, it's not that we suddenly have goodness. It's that a whole bunch of other Hitlers develop as a result of changing the goalposts. And now Trump is Hitler. So this process, I guess, yeah, if you had to say if Hitler is the moral axiom, the moral evil of the world, then you would have to say the polar opposite of him, and therefore the good would be Judaism, it would be globalism, it would be minoritarianism. So understanding this, then, we need to take on, if we want to be morally good people with respect to this global culture, we have to be minoritarian, we have to be trans-Jewish, we have to be gender fluid. We have to recognize, okay, well, today I'm feeling a little more dominant, today I'm feeling a little more masochistic, today I'm feeling a little more sadistic. That schizophrenia is required to be considered a moral person. You have to have all these different masks. You can't be like, a farmer from Minnesota who's just he's Big Jim, he's just the same day in, day out, doesn't change a thing. Honest Big Jim. If he told a lie, he'd tell you, he'd tell you straight, he would never tell a lie. That sort of almost what we describe now as a two-dimensional personality. Someone who is completely honest, someone who's completely transparent. That is immoral, effectively, because it's too concrete, it's too tangible. It's not polymorphic. It's a fascist personality. It's too high on the F scale. So, that's sort of something that I wanted to discuss and put it in terms that are not, and people on both sides have said, I'm not saying anything new, but people have said, Jews have said, we really live in a Jewish world. Look at how much Jews have influenced global culture. And then people have come from the other side and said, well, look how evil these Jews are because they control the world. So people have come at it from both an extreme positive and extreme negative, sort of saying that this thing is true and therefore it is good or therefore it is bad. But I'm just saying it's true that this is the situation we live in. And you can either take that in a positive direction and say, great, let's run with that. Let's succeed within this system. Let's fulfill the desires of this system. Let's idealize this system and run with it and get whatever we can out of it. And then other people can go in the other direction and say, okay, now we've identified the system. Now that we've finally identified it, now we can work about deconstructing it, or now we can work about confronting it. And, if you put me in ancient Greece, and you said to me, you have to assume that Olympian culture, the Greek gods, the Greek pantheon, all of that's evil. And what you want to do is you want to wipe that out from Greek society. Tell me, how would you do it? I would say, I don't know. You could have the Romans come in, but they're quite similar. You'd have to have some foreign culture come in to wipe people out. If we're talking about a global culture, there is no aliens who are going to come and wipe us out and replace our culture. So again, put yourself in this thought experiment. If you're in medieval Christian Europe, ask yourself, how do you wipe out Christianity? Well, you can't. It's the dominant culture. There is no, okay, what revolution are you going to use to destroy Christianity? I say, well, I can't do that. I would need some kind of technological revolution to bring about some kind of industrial society to create the conditions for communism, to have a revolution in Russia, and then maybe I could start destroying Christianity. But barring that, if you're put within a culture where there's a dominant axiom and you ask yourself, well, how can I have a revolution? And this is what all these white nationalists are asking themselves. They're saying, okay, we're in this cultural situation. How do we revolt against it? How do we establish the polar opposite moral axioms? How do we gain power in this way? And I would say, well, I don't know. Compare yourself to any other historical example that is comparable, where you have a dominant ideal in society. How do you overthrow a dominant ideal? I'm not sure it can be done. I'm thinking maybe of Socrates being convicted for blasphemy against the gods. Did Socrates somehow, transcend Greek culture and lead to something different? Did Plato somehow feed into that? We could suppose. They were philosophers. They theorized. And maybe they did rebel against certain dogmatic aspects of historical Greek culture, and maybe they did bring something new out of that. But ultimately, we might gain things from reading them. But our perception is that they are the archetypal Greeks, which is an interesting conception. If we do conceive of them as rebels against traditional Greek society, Plato saying we have to come up with some kind of, it's very Freemasonic, we have to come up with some kind of lie, a noble lie to tell people in order to create eugenic conditions in society. This is what he says, the myth of the metals. And then Socrates goes on criticizing, deconstructing everything. So, in a sense, they were the most anti-Greek of the Greeks. They were the least Greek of all the Greeks, and yet we remember them as the greatest of the Greeks, as the archetypal of the Greeks, which is interesting. But if people are asking for a solution, they're asking, how do you confront a dominant culture and just overturn it? I'd say, well, do you have money? Do you have media? Do you have the military behind you? You don't have any of that? Well, I'm not sure what you're going to do. I don't think there is a solution to this problem, at least not within your lifetime. So then you have to make the choice. Do you create some kind of internalized moral sphere, some kind of internalized moral universe? Really, what you're talking about is taking a minoritarian approach. You're saying, we're swimming in this globalist culture, and we want to create some kind of conservative or nationalist or ethnocentric little paradise or some kind of archipelago. We want to create a little ghetto of nationalism. Well, that's a minoritarian strategy. So in trying to defeat the concept of minoritarianism globally, you have to embrace minoritarianism. That's something that Wilhelm Marr recognized. And I was just watching a little bit of E. Michael Jones, and he continuously refers to Wilhelm Marr as the inventor of the term anti-Semitism, which is not correct. The first use of the term anti-Semitism was used by, and let me see if I can, term anti-Semite, French, let's see if he, because the term Semite as a French term, I know these are all contemporary articles, but anyway, I think it was 1961, before Wilhelm Marr had ever used the term anti-Semitism, that there was a French Jew who was using the term Semite and anti-Semite, probably using the German pronunciation rather than the French pronunciation, but whatever. So that preceded him, and that term, he may have popularized it, but there's very little evidence that he actually invented it. But Marr commented later in his life in the 1890s, he said, the anti-Semites, in order to beat the Jews, they've emulated the Jews. So they criticized the Jews for being media masters, and now all the anti-Semites care about is their newspapers and their publications and making money and gaining viewers, exactly the same as the people they criticize. And he goes down the list and compares them in that way. And so there is that sense in which when the Japanese wanted to become free from Western imperialism, they had to embrace a lot of Western technology and Western customs. They embraced the Western suit. They embraced, learning English. They embraced Western technology. So there is a Hegelian dialectic here where there is a thesis put forth, there's an antithesis, but often what happens is a synthesis, in that you think you're trying to get the opposite of something, but you actually end up taking on elements of it or emulating parts of it. In fighting your enemy, you sort of learn the tactics of your enemy and you adopt and you learn from them what you can. That's a situation people get themselves into. So that's the historical, post-historical vision I have right now of where we are at globally. I don't know if any of that was helpful or interesting, but it's something that I wanted to share so that an idea doesn't really become formalized in my mind or concrete until I speak it. And so now that I've said it, I can dream about it, contemplate it, criticize it, and you can help me with that. And then we can build from there. See if it's a solid idea, see if it's going to take us anywhere, or if it then needs to be recycled and we go on to something else. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.